Hello, this is Mary Robinette Kowal. The process of being critiqued is frustrating and kind of mysterious sometimes, so I wanted to talk about how to give a critique, but more importantly, how to receive one as well. As an author, kind of imagine that your story is a drug going through clinical trials. You have this perfect idea in your head. You know exactly the effect that you want to achieve in your audience. So you hand it to a beta reader to find out whether or not it works. Those reactions, the reactions that you get, break down into three types of reactions. There are symptoms, diagnosis, and prescriptions. Now, symptoms are straight up, this is how I reacted to the story, without trying to make any guesses about why. That's what you're mostly looking for, and I'll talk a little bit more about symptoms in a minute. But you're mostly looking for symptoms. Then there's diagnosis. This is how I reacted, and this is why I think I reacted that way. Diagnosis is a little trickier because sometimes the person who is offering the diagnosis doesn't understand everything that's going on in the background, so they may misdiagnose things, and that can be frustrating for both of you. And then there's prescription. And this is how I reacted. This is why I think I reacted that way, and this is how you should fix it. Now, the number of people that you should go to for a prescription are really, really few. I will do that sometimes with my editor and sometimes with very trusted friends, but most of the time, all I'm looking for when I hand a story to a reader is just their list of symptoms. I just want to know how the story is making them react, and then I can decide from there what I want to fix. So when you're looking at the symptoms, what symptoms are you specifically looking for? I look for four. I look for things that threw me out of the story, or threw the reader out of the story. And those are things they didn't believe, didn't care about, didn't understand. And then the fourth thing isn't something that throws you out of the story, but is important to know. Things they thought are cool, because you don't want to accidentally fix those. So what you're looking for is if you can have a reader just flag those things for you, you can decide from there how you want to address anything that isn't doing the effect that you want it to go for. So you've got your symptoms, which are didn't believe, didn't care, and didn't understand. And then the diagnosis, which is why you think you're having that reaction. Very trusted readers, you can get those from, but most of the time, just symptoms. Now, generally speaking, once you've fixed or edited a story, give it to fresh readers who won't have a preconception from an earlier draft. The exception to this is if you have an expert that you're asking about science or something, some speciality. Those you might go back to more than once. Or if you've got someone that had a point of confusion, you might go back to the person and hand them that section and say, is this clear? But you want to try to ask it in a way that isn't giving them a leading question. So that's kind of how to give a critique. You focus on the symptomatic reactions. Then there's how to receive a critique. Here's where it gets a little harder. A lot of people have heard the advice that when you are writing, you should turn off your internal editor. Now, I do think that this is good advice for a brand new writer, but I think it's advice that should go away after a certain point. The reason I think it's good advice for a beginning writer is because you're trying to train your writer brain and your editor brain at the same time. And if you allow the editor brain to be training itself while you're writing, you're going to wind up stopping a lot. It'll be kind of like this. You're writing along and the editor says, wait, that's not very good. And the writer is like, oh, okay, how do I fix it? And the editor says, give me a second, and you have stopped writing. So that's why people will tell you to turn off the internal editor. But as anyone who's been working for a long time knows, a really good editor can make your story better. So if you can train your internal editor so it can work in tandem with your internal writer, then your writing is going to be smoother. And this is where critiquing comes in very handy. Because as you are critiquing someone else's story, you have completely removed your internal writer from the equation. You're just dealing with the internal editor. And your internal editor can just be saying, okay, today I'm going to learn how to identify symptoms. Great. So you can identify one of those 4. Then, as you start receiving critiques, your internal editor can be training itself to understand diagnosis. It gets the symptoms from somebody else, and then it can diagnose them. And I say that diagnosis comes in 4 flavors. And those are, "No!" And this is where the person says something, offers a symptom, and you're like, "Oh, I cannot even believe I did that. You are completely right. Let me fix that immediately." You know exactly what they're talking about. You completely agree that it's a problem, and you know how to fix it. That's a "No!" reaction. The second reaction is, "I see it, but I think you've identified a different problem." And this often happens when you get someone who gives a diagnosis as well. But you'll get sometimes, you'll get a reaction like this. This actually happened to me. "Oh, the airship captain was so interesting, and I just really wanted to know about the scar on his face. I was a little confused about where it came from and whether or not it was going to play an important role in the story later. And how is he so cranky? Why is he..." And they just go on about the airship captain. And you're like, actually, he's just there to get them from point A to point B and doesn't really play a role in the story. So they've identified a problem. Their problem is that they're confused about the airship captain, but the actual problem is you've made him too interesting. And so you just basically cut him back. So that's, "I see it, but it's not the problem you think it is." The third one is, "I disagree." And this is when someone usually wants your story to be a different story than the one you're telling. "I wish this story were all about the airship captain." Like, no, that's not the story I'm writing. I could look at those a little bit to see if there's a trend of those, because if I get a number of people telling me the same kind of thing that I don't agree with, there is a possibility that I have something else going on in the story that I need to take a look at. But usually, I just disagree with them, and you just ignore those. And then the fourth one is, "WTF? What?" And this is when someone's reaction is so off base that you cannot understand how they got there. Like, what are you talking about? How are we reading the same story? So as an example, in one of my novels, I had this beta reader say, "Oh, I wish I had known that Vincent was manic depressive." And I'm like, "What? He is so not manic depressive. I mean, he's moody, but he's not manic depressive." And I was completely baffled. And so here's what you do when you get this reaction. You go back to the person and you query. Here's where you ask for the diagnosis. "Can you tell me why you thought he was manic depressive?" And you try to make that as clean a question as possible. Do not lead them. Just, "Can you tell me why you thought that you had this reaction?" And the reaction that I got was, "Well, you talk about how he's manically pacing around the room." I'm like, that's it? So I took out that one word, and the problem completely went away. And it turned out that I had had a couple of people that were in the disagree area. I was like, I don't see what they're talking about. People that I thought were outliers that I was more or less ignoring, that when I made that one change, none of those, all of the other problems went away. So the WTF reaction is one of the ones that I pay most attention to. So that's kind of how you take the critique in. If you know how to fix it, great, fix it. Mostly what you're learning to do when you are receiving a critique is to train your internal editor on the diagnosis. Once you've gone through the critique, then you can sit down and work on the prescription. But that's in the revision process. We're not going to worry about that right now. Right now, I just want you to worry about training yourself on how to learn to report symptoms and diagnose.